His inaugural voyage was tentative, for he was an inexperienced Arctic traveler. It was necessary to assess the difficulties of the journey he intended to undertake. Departing America in May 1886, he arrived in Godhaven, where he met his friend Christian Mygard, a high-ranking official who would accompany him on his journey. They sailed up Packetsock Fjord and reached their starting point. After carefully surveying the glacier and discovering a feasible ice tongue, they set off with 2 Eskimos and provisions for 3 weeks. The ice field was riddled with countless crevasses that needed negotiating, but travel was not impossible. The party penetrated the interior about 100 miles before a lack of provisions forced them to retreat. He returned to America more enthusiastic than ever about his plans to explore the north of Greenland. It was not until 1891 that he could embark on his second journey on the steamboat Kite, commanded by Captain Richard Pick. His wife, Dr. Cook Gibson, John Verhoef, his colored servant, and Elvin Astrup, a young Norwegian who did excellent work, accompanied him. A group of 9 scientists, including Professor Heilprin, also accompanied them, conducting research and observations while Peary was away on his longitude journey. One serious misadventure marked the passage out, as Peary broke his leg, rendering him helpless when the party landed at McCormick Bay. He was unable to participate in any of the short autumn trips around Inglefield Gulf. The first days after their arrival at the bay were spent in the erection of the portable dwelling they called Redcliffe House. When spring arrived, Peary and his wife journeyed around Inglefield Gulf. On May 14th, Peary set off on his longitude journey, which would be the highlight of his expedition. The initial part of the journey was slow, taking a week to round Inglefield Gulf while discovering 30 glaciers, 10 of them of the first magnitude. Peary sent 2 of the 4 men back when they reached Whale Sound and Cane Sea. With Astrup as his only companion, Peary moved north, reaching the northern edge of the inland ice on June 26th. Unable to go further in that direction, they turned southeast, hoping to reach the east coast of Greenland. On July 4th, they arrived at Independence Bay, which they named in honor of the day. From the top of a cliff, 4,000 feet high, they obtained a magnificent view of the land around them, confirming that Greenland was an island. Only 8 of the 21 dogs survived. They returned to Redcliffe House, which they reached on August 6th without incident. The Kite arrived a few days later, and they returned to America, 1 member short, as John Verhoef was lost in a snowstorm while hunting. His experiences convinced Peary that there was a vast opportunity for discovery in the north of Greenland. He promptly set about raising funds for a 3rd expedition by delivering lectures on his experiences. His efforts were successful, and in the autumn of 1893, he was once again established in Whale Sound. However, this time he found far more satisfactory quarters in Bowden Bay, an indentation on the north shore of Inglefield Gulf. He built a house called Anniversary Lodge with modern improvements, including electric light. On August 29th, Astrup and 3 companions set out to lay down caches of provisions for the great spring journey. Unfortunately, Astrup fell ill after only depositing 2 caches, and they had to hurry home without properly locating the spots. On September 12th, a very interesting event took place. Mrs. Peary, who was also a member of the expedition, gave birth to a daughter. On March 6, 1894, Peary set out on his spring journey with 7 men, 12 sleds, and 92 dogs, with enough provisions to last 6 months. Unfortunately, the weather was not favorable. His men were frostbitten, and his dogs froze to death before his eyes. Peary had to send back most of his party and push on with only 3 companions. However, circumstances were too much for him, and he had to admit defeat. When he finally reached Bowden Bay on April 15th, only 26 dogs remained out of the original 92. The rest of the spring and the early part of the summer were spent exploring and mapping out the unknown shores of Melville Bay. During one of these journeys, Peary reached Cape York, where he unearthed 2 gigantic meteorites that had attracted many previous explorers, none of whom had managed to find them. Later on, he succeeded in bringing them to America, along with a 3rd so large that its removal required several months of hard work. August saw the arrival of the Falcon, sent to retrieve the explorers, but Peary was far from content with his work of the year. Despite returning early due to a lack of provisions and fuel, and the uncertainty of another ship visit during the next year, Peary refused to leave Bowden Bay. He was determined to spend another year there with Hugh Lee and his African-American assistant, Nansen. Peary sent the rest of his party home while he prepared for winter. The fall was spent recruiting Eskimos, hunting and searching for the caches left by Astrup. Peary failed to find the caches, but the hunting was successful enough for him and his two companions to spend the winter in relative comfort. On April 2, 1895, Peary, his 2 volunteers, 4 Eskimos, and 63 dogs set out on their spring journey, with 4 sleds. The Eskimos, however, were not helpful, with 1 deserting on the 3rd day, and the remaining 3 being sent back shortly thereafter. Peary and his 2 companions persevered through challenging obstacles. Terrible snowstorms raged around them, obliterating their landmarks and concealing their cache of pemmican. Lee was frostbitten, the dogs died, and game was scarce. Despite these difficulties, Peary pushed on and arrived near Independence Bay in early May. He was lucky enough to kill 10 musk oxen, but no other game was found. They were forced to rush back to camp as fast as possible. With only 9 dogs left and food for 17 days, they went as fast as they could and succeeded in winning their desperate race against starvation. They arrived at Bowden Bay on June 25th, having eaten their last scrap of food, with only 1 dog left out of the 65 they started with. The Kite arrived later in the summer to retrieve them, and they reached Newfoundland in September, after one of the most hazardous journeys on record. Chapter 29. The Expedition of F.G. Jackson and Alfred Harmsworth. The triumph of Mr. Lee Smith's mission prompted another celebrated English explorer, Mr. F.G. Jackson, to turn his attention towards Franz Joseph Land. His goal was twofold: to survey the unfamiliar terrain and to inch closer to the pole. Jackson announced his plans in 1892, but despite widespread support from Arctic experts, no one offered the necessary funding. In 1893, he embarked on an expedition to the Ugor Straits, with the aim of exploring Waigat's Island and testing his equipment for the Franz Joseph Land voyage. The journey was a resounding success, and after completing his mission, Jackson decided to extend his travels through Lapland and the White Sea. He wished to immerse himself in the customs of the Lapps and the Samoyeds, with whom he had traveled. It was during this journey that he first discovered the usefulness of the robust Russian ponies that would prove invaluable on his later voyage. While he was away, Jackson received a telegram with the welcome news that Alfred Harmsworth, soon to become Lord Northcliffe, had generously agreed to fund his expedition to Franz Joseph Land. Rather than immediately returning home, Jackson continued his investigations in Lapland. Once finished, he hastened back to England and immediately began preparing for his new campaign. He needed a suitable vessel for the journey ahead, and after careful consideration, he chose the Windward, a steam whaler weighing 461 tons. The equipment for the 3-year expedition was meticulously prepared, ensuring that everything necessary for their stay in the Arctic regions was included. Mr. Jackson was equally fortunate in his selection of staff, with the success of the expedition being due in large part to the work of his doctor, Reginald Hetlitz, botanist, Mr. Harry Fisher, and mineralogist, Mr. Child. In July 1894, the Windward set sail down the Thames, reaching Archangel in early August, where they took on board dogs, ponies, and portable houses. The passage across the Barents Sea was not without its challenges, taking 11 days, while another 2 weeks were spent approaching Bell Island due to the girdle of ice surrounding it. On September 10th, however, the Windward anchored off Cape Flora, the westernmost point of Northbrook Island, and the party erected their winter house, Elmwood. Mr. Jackson proved to be an excellent disciplinarian, ensuring that every member of his party was kept busy to maintain good health. If they weren't working, they were hunting or playing games. The results were remarkable, with not a single member of the party falling ill or needing to stop working due to illness. In contrast, the Windward crew, who were not under his direct supervision and had the freedom to occupy their time as they pleased, suffered from scurvy, and some even succumbed to it. The winter passed uneventfully. When spring arrived, They readied their sleds for the first exploration journey. On April 16th, Jackson and his companions, Lieutenant Armitage and Blomqvist, journeyed north. They reached Back Island, where Nansen and Johansen would later build their winter hut. However, their journey was halted by a mixture of snow and mud, making it impossible for their ponies to continue. They returned to Elmwood House. In June, the Windward left for England, leaving the explorers behind. The voyage was treacherous, taking 65 days to navigate through dense pack ice. They ran out of coal and had to burn anything they could spare to keep the engines going. Jackson and his companions turned their attention to the uncharted land to the west. They spent the summer exploring and mapping out Alexandra Land. During their second winter at Cape Flora, one of their ponies was found dead in its stable, while another fell ill and died. Otherwise, the winter passed without incident. In the spring, they journeyed north along the shores of the British Channel, and Jackson and his crew added countless islands and capes to the map of Franz Josef Land. Although their discoveries held great geographic value, we need not delve into them now. It wasn't until June 17th that an event of true significance occurred. Jackson wrote the story in his own words. After dinner, he writes, Armitage came running down to tell me that, through his field glasses, he could see a man on the floe to the southeast of Cape Flora, about 4 miles away. I could hardly believe it. Such a thing seemed impossible. I thought he had mistaken a walrus on the ice for a man. But after I got a glass, I could see that he was correct. I could also make out a staff or mast, with another man standing close to the water's edge. It occurred to me then that it might be one of my own men, although they had all been at dinner a few minutes before. But I soon found that all were present. I got a gun as quickly as possible and fired a shot on the bank to try to get the stranger's attention. Then I set off to meet him, crossing the ice. On our approach about 3 miles away from the land, I saw a tall man on skis. He wore roughly made clothes and an old felt hat on his head. He was covered in oil and grease, and black from head to foot. I immediately concluded from his ski that he was not an English sailor. He must have been a man from some Norwegian walrus sloop who had come to grief and wintered somewhere on Franz Josef Land in very rough circumstances. His hair was long and dirty. His complexion appeared to be fair, but dirt prevented me from being sure on this point, and his beard was straggly and dirty too. We shook hands heartily, and I expressed the greatest pleasure at seeing him. I asked if he had a ship. No, he replied. My ship is not here, rather sadly, I thought. He then said that he had only one companion, who was at the floe edge. It then struck me that despite the black grease and long hair and beard, he resembled Nansen, whom I had met once in London before he started his 1893 voyage. I exclaimed, "Aren't you Nansen?" To which he replied, "Yes, I am Nansen." With much heartiness, I shook him by the hand and said, "By Jove, I'm damn glad to see you." The two explorers had found themselves hopelessly lost in the frozen north, each attempting to solve the same problem from different angles. Luckily, they stumbled upon each other, avoiding the fatal voyage toward Spitzbergen in 2 vulnerable kayaks. Jackson, a friendly face, welcomed and refreshed the weary travelers, providing them with their first meal and bath in a year. After some time and effort, the explorers recovered. In the next year, Jackson persisted in surveying the uncharted terrain, and his efforts were rewarded. He discovered that the land consisted of numerous islands, separated by swift channels that kept the ice in constant motion. While this made travel difficult, it also created open waterways teeming with walruses. Jackson also debunked the existence of phantom lands, such as Gillies and King Oscar, and made countless valuable scientific observations. Jackson had hoped to prolong his stay in Franz Josef Land for another year in order to venture further north. However, he and his party were forced to return to England when the Windward arrived on August 6th. Before departing, they left behind a stockpile of supplies for the intrepid explorer André, should he find himself in that region. Chapter 30. The Fram and Nansen. Nansen, after studying Arctic expeditions of the past, was convinced that the routes taken by previous explorers to reach the North Pole were either impossible or fraught with such difficulties that only the lucky would overcome them. Ships that tried to navigate the far north were always obstructed by an impenetrable layer of ice. Travelers who attempted the journey on sleds found the ice too rough, and the movement of the pack too unsettling, forcing them to return before they could make significant progress. Additionally, there are no suitable lands in sufficiently northern latitudes to serve as bases for such expeditions. However, the experiences of the Jeannette caused Nansen to consider another approach. The ill-fated vessel was trapped in ice near Wrangel Land and eventually drifted to New Siberia, where it sank. 3 years later, articles from the sunken vessel were found frozen in the drift ice near Julianshaab on the southwest coast of Greenland. These articles were discovered by Eskimos and later collected by Mr. Litzen, the colonial manager at Julianshaab. Among them was a list of provisions signed by DeLong, a pair of sealskin breeches marked with the name of Louis Noros, one of the Jeannette's crew, the peak of a cap belonging to Nindemann, another sailor, and a manuscript list of the ship's boats. Professor Mohn, in a lecture delivered before the Scientific Society of Christiania, demonstrated that these articles must have drifted across the pole, a theory supported by the fact that Siberian larch pine trees had often been found on the east coast of Greenland. Nansen concluded that if the articles could drift across the pole, he could do the same. When Nansen proposed to test his theory, he faced intense opposition. His plan involved abandoning the well-known Arctic rule to never leave the shore. Critics claimed that constructing a ship capable of withstanding the winter ice was impossible, and that Nansen was risking his own life and the lives of his companions. But Nansen persisted, and in October 1892, a vessel named the Fram was launched at the Christiania Fjord. The ship's sides were 30 inches thick and reinforced with stanchions to withstand pressure. The hull was especially shaped to rise when squeezed by ice. The Fram was only 128 feet long, but very broad. Her speed under steam and sail was expected to be 8 or 9 knots an hour in favorable circumstances, and under steam alone, not more than 3 knots. The crew consisted of 13, including Captain Sverdrup, Lieutenant Johansen, and Lieutenant Scott Hansen, responsible for scientific observations. The Fram departed from Christiania on June 24, 1893, and soon sailed along the north coast of Europe. On August 4th, it entered the Kara Sea, and at the end of the month, off Timor Island, it encountered serious ice. Nansen discovered a new group of islands and considered wintering off them. Fortunately, a storm broke up the ice on September 6th, and he proceeded toward Cape Chelyuskin. Nansen had intended to stop at Olenek for dogs, but did not dare to linger since the summer was so far along. He pushed north past New Siberia and entered the pack at latitude 78 degrees on September 29th. As soon as the ice had truly taken hold of the vessel, and there was no further prospect of release, preparations for the winter were set in motion. The rudder was taken off, the hold was cleared out to make room for a carpenter's shop, the engine was taken apart, and a mechanical workshop was established in its space. A forge was built, tin work was done in the chart room, and shoemaking and sailmaking took place in the saloon. There was nothing, says Nansen, from the most delicate instruments down to wooden shoes and axe handles that could not be made on the Fram. There was always something to occupy us, and it was not difficult to find work for each man that gave him sufficient exercise and so much distraction that the time did not seem unbearably long. However, it is not to be assumed that Nansen did not occasionally suffer from boredom. This was especially the case when the Fram was steadily drifting southwest for several weeks, much to his dismay. Eventually, though, she resumed her northward journey, and from then on her course gave her crew little reason for dissatisfaction, albeit she did not approach the pole as closely as had been expected. Additionally, the ship behaved remarkably well in the ice, and withstood the most serious pressures. Contrary to the belief of many experts, who had thought that, frozen into the pack ice as she was, she could not possibly rise from her bed and force the incoming ice beneath her. She would at times be lifted so high above the surface that her bottom was almost visible. Nansen, aboard the Fram, anticipated that the ship would follow his intended course. However, he believed that he could further explore the sea beyond the ship's route if he and a companion set out on sleds with dogs. Nansen understood that they would not be able to locate the vessel again since it would be continuously moving. Nevertheless, he did not fear finding his way back home to civilization. On March 14, 1895, accompanied by Johansen, Nansen departed with 28 dogs, 3 sleds, 2 kayaks, 30 days' worth of food for their dogs, and 100 days' worth of rations for themselves. The venture was daring, almost insane, but Nansen and Johansen exhibited such courage and determination that they accomplished it, although not without extreme hardships. They encountered high ridges of ice, which the snow never had time to cover, and had to drag the sleds over them while the dogs watched from the sidelines. The ice worsened as they continued north, until Nansen climbed to the highest point on April 7th and saw nothing but packed, piled-up ice extending to the horizon, resembling a rough sea that had solidified. He realized that it would be foolish to continue, so they turned south and headed for Franz Josef Land after reaching latitude 86 degrees, 14 north, the farthest point reached until then. They found better ice on the return journey and made quick progress. However, their eagerness to push onward led to excessively long marches, causing them to stop for the night on April 12th, after more than 36 hours without pitching their tents, and with their watches stopped. They could only guess at the time, and were unable to determine their longitude accurately from that day onwards. Payer's inaccurate map caused them much concern. They expected to sight Peterman's Land towards the end of April, but May and June passed without any sighting. By June 22nd, traveling had become so difficult that they decided to wait until the snow melted, and only resumed their journey on July 22nd. 2 days later they finally saw land, but had to traverse numerous channels and crushed floes, jumping from one piece of ice to another and dragging the sleds. This was a hazardous process that almost resulted in disaster. While preparing to cross an open canyon of ice, an incident occurred that almost cost Johansen his life. Nansen was holding his kayak with one hand to prevent it from slipping into the water when he heard a scuffle behind him, and Johansen's voice shouting, "Take the gun!" Glancing about, he spied an enormous polar bear launching itself at his partner. He lunged for his firearm, resting on the foredeck, but the kayak slipped away from his grasp and plunged into the water. "Hurry up if you want to arrive on time," Johansen murmured calmly, as Nansen made a valiant effort to retrieve his gun and fire upon the bear before it reached its prey. Fortunately, he did, and a warning shot caused the bear to retreat. After much toil, they triumphantly arrived at Frederick Jackson Island, where they decided to winter, recognizing that the season was too far advanced to embark on the hazardous journey to Spitzbergen. They proceeded to construct a cabin and hunt walruses and bears, of which they found such a plentiful supply that they soon secured themselves against the threat of starvation. Though small, the hut was somewhat cozy. "By using lamps," Nansen remarked, "we managed to maintain the temperature at approximately freezing point within the center of the cabin, while it was naturally lower near the walls." The latter were encased in a thick layer of frost and ice, which, when illuminated by lamplight, presented such a stunningly marble-like appearance that, in our more contented moments, we could envision ourselves dwelling inside marble halls. Since they had nothing to do, they remained in bed for 20 hours out of every 24, with their bed consisting of massive hard stones that were not particularly comfortable. On Christmas Day, they celebrated by reversing their shirts inside out. Their clothing, incidentally, was always a point of concern, since washing presented a problem that they were entirely incapable of resolving. They managed to keep themselves reasonably clean, in part by scraping their bodies with knives, and in part by rubbing bear fat into their skin and wiping it away with moss. However, even though they experimented with boiling their undergarments and scraping them with knives, the strategy was not especially effective, and they longed for a bar of soap. May 19th marked the beginning of their journey once more, and they managed to make decent headway whether on ice or in open water. There were a few mishaps, one of which could have had catastrophic consequences. The kayak carrying their provisions and guns decided to embark on its own journey, leaving them stranded on the shore. Nansen had to swim after it, and the struggle with the frigid water left him depleted. He barely made it to the kayak and scrambled over the gunwale. Fortunately, their troubles came to an end when Nansen heard barking dogs while preparing breakfast one morning. At first he couldn't believe his ears, but the sound grew louder and closer until it was unmistakable. He rushed off on his skis to investigate and met F.G. Jackson, who welcomed him warmly. However, their meeting has already been recounted in the chapter dedicated to the Jackson expedition, so we need not rehash it here. Meanwhile, the Fram continued to drift with the ice, reaching nearly the same latitude as Nansen on October 16th. The ship made its way to the edge of the pack without incident, and after a series of blasting operations, was freed from the ice and returned home safely. Chapter 31. Sir Martin Conway and André's Balloon. Nordenskjöld had thoroughly explored Northeast Land, revealing it as one vast ice field. However, West Spitzbergen had received little attention, and until the end of the previous century, nobody knew anything about its formation or geography. In 1896, Sir Martin Conway, a renowned mountaineer, sought to conquer new worlds and unravel the mystery surrounding the region. Obtaining information about the area was challenging. He read all available literature and gathered sleds and ponies, essential for success. With a party consisting of Mr. East J. Garwood, his photographer, Dr. Gregory, the geologist, Trevor Batty, the ornithologist, and his nephew, H. East Conway, as the artist, he began his travels from Advent Bay, where he found a Norwegian company constructing an inn. Though an inn in an uninhabited place like Spitzbergen seemed out of place, a series of trips had been organized, and a steamer brought out tourists weekly, most of whom were drawn by André's balloon, waiting at the north end of the island for a chance to begin its perilous journey. Conway and Mr. Garwood commenced their journey across the island on June 20th, leaving 3 members of their party to conduct scientific research near the coast. They soon discovered that their sleds and ponies were a hindrance, as the interior was not covered by an ice sheet like that of Northeast Land. Instead, they found a land with a temperate climate, crossed by green mountains and boggy valleys perpetually sticky from the constant rain. The ponies always sank in the mud, necessitating hours of laborious digging or pulling. Conway had intended to quickly traverse the island and return, but he discovered that the island was undergoing a process of mountain creation. The canyons in the interior were slowly carving their way into ridges, forming isolated peaks. Fascinated by this, Conway altered his plans and journeyed slowly over the impressive Ivory Glacier to Fowles Bay, before returning via a slightly different path. Upon reaching Advent Bay, he learned of a tourist steamer that had made an incredible journey to latitude 81 degrees 32 north. Inspired, he rented the 12-ton steamer Express and circled the coast, visiting Wellman's hut and André's balloon. He desired to do more, but a dangerous ice blink in the sky caused the captain to refuse to venture any further in such a small boat. Ice blink is a white light seen near the horizon, especially on the underside of low clouds, resulting from the reflection of light off an ice field immediately beyond. The following year, Conway and Mr. Garwood returned to Spitzbergen to study glacier formation. As Conway explored, André was preparing for his ill-fated expedition to discover the North Pole. André was a skilled Swedish engineer and aeronaut who had successfully crossed the Baltic in a balloon. He believed a steady south wind could quickly carry a balloon to the pole, a feat that would take weeks on foot. André's ambition ultimately cost him his life. The balloon project appealed to many imaginative explorers and investors, and the aeronaut had little difficulty in obtaining the necessary funds. Among those who contributed to them being the King of Sweden, the late Alfred Nobel, and Baron Dixon. The construction of the balloon was entrusted to La Chambre of Paris. The material used was Chinese pongé silk, cemented together in double, threefold, and fourfold layers, and covered with a coating of special varnish. Its contents were slightly under 160,000 cubic feet. It was to be guided by a sail fitted with guide ropes which would drag along the ground and prevent the balloon from being driven at the full force of the wind. The difference between the velocity of the wind and of the slowed balloon was to be utilized for steering. During testing, the plan worked well. The Virgo, carrying with it André, his balloon, and a party of geologists, left Tromsø on June 14, 1896, and 9 days later, A suitable place for building the balloon house was found on Danes Island. The landing of the balloon and the building of the house occupied nearly a month, and it was not until July 27th that everything was ready for a start. Unfortunately, however, the wind, which had been for the most part favorable while the preparations were in progress, now changed direction, and for the rest of the summer it blew steadily from the north, when it did not drop altogether. Week after week passed by without bringing any prospects of a start, and at last André was obliged to pack up his balloon and return home, hoping for better luck next year. On May 30th, he returned to Danes Island with his balloon, which had undergone various modifications during the winter. The house had fallen into disrepair, but was quickly restored, and the inflation of the balloon began on June 19th, finishing at midnight on the 22nd. Everything was set for a launch, and on Sunday, July 11th, André took advantage of a strong southerly breeze. Standing in the car with his comrades, Frenkel and Strindberg, he gave the order to cut the ropes. The balloon quickly rose to 600 feet, then, after a brief descent, floated away north over the flat peninsula of Hollanderness. It remained visible to those at Danes Island for approximately an hour before disappearing over the northern horizon, never to be seen again. The world received no further news of André and his companions, and the mystery of their fate remained unsolved. Of the 13 buoys carried on board, only 4 were ever found. One was discovered at Skjervo in Norway, containing a message that it was thrown out at 10 o'clock on the night of July 11th. Another buoy, dispatched an hour later when the party reached 82 degrees north, 250 east longitude, was recovered off the coast of Iceland. The remaining 2 buoys bore no message from the explorer. On July 15, 1897, the sailors of the SS Alken shot a carrier pigeon released 2 days previously, but it was the last news of the explorers ever to reach their loved ones at home. Numerous expeditions were dispatched in an effort to rescue the ill-fated explorers. Native populations reported the sound of gunfire emanating from the ice and sightings of figures adrift on the frozen floes. Even fishermen claimed to have heard desperate cries for assistance, and spotted what they believed to be a deflated balloon drifting aimlessly upon the sea. However, despite following these leads with great care, they ultimately led nowhere. One can only assume that the men perished hopelessly, succumbing to starvation and exposure upon a massive ice field far removed from any possibility of human intervention. Such a tragedy likely occurred somewhere between the remote Arctic locations of Spitsbergen, Nova Zembla, and Siberia. Chapter 32. Sverdrup and Peary's later expeditions. Otto Sverdrup's love for Arctic travel stemmed from his time as Nansen's companion and second-in-command on the Fram. This led him to embark on his own expedition in 1898, with the goal of completing the survey of the northern shores of Greenland, and discovering whether there was any land beyond in the direction of the North Pole. If not, he planned to explore Grinnell and Ellesmere lands, which remained largely uncharted. Sverdrup set sail from Upernavik on August 5th aboard the Fram, which had been refitted for the new voyage. He made his way up Smith Sound, and decided to winter at Hayes Sound, where there was plenty of work to be done. He explored Ellesmere Island and prepared to push north in the spring. However, unfavorable conditions forced him to abandon his plan of following the north coast of Greenland and instead explore Jones Sound, which had never been fully explored. Sverdrup succeeded in exploring Jones Sound and spent the following winter on the south coast of Ellesmere Land. Meanwhile, the Fram almost met its demise due to a fire while Sverdrup was exploring the coast. However, the ship was saved, and Sverdrup continued his exploration of North Devon during the spring and summer. Returning to the Fram, Sverdrup found that the ship was stuck in the ice, and he was forced to spend another winter at the mouth of Belcher Channel. He continued his exploration of the area, and made a journey north, which added to the maps of cartographers. In the summer, the Fram was set free, and Sverdrup's journey came to a close. While Sverdrup's journey lacked sensational incidents, his work over 4 years was admirable. He mapped the west coast of Ellesmere Land, discovered 3 large islands west of the land, exploring North Devon and the northern shores of North Cornwall and Findlay Island, and proved that land existed north of the Peary Islands. Although he did not reach the northern shores of Greenland, he had no reason to be dissatisfied with the outcome of his journey. In America, the Peary Arctic Club was founded to provide funds for Robert Peary's explorations. In 1898, Peary set sail from Sydney in the Windward, which had been presented to him by Sir Alfred Harmsworth, to complete his examination of the northern shores of Greenland and attempt to reach the North Pole. The expedition was the most perfectly planned to date. The Windward was preceded by the auxiliary ship the Hope, which sailed for home after depositing its stores at Etah. The Windward sailed for Smith Sound but was forced to winter near Cape d'Urville due to ice. Peary had 3 goals for the autumn: survey the land around his winter quarters, obtain fresh meat, and stash provisions along the coast. He was successful in all 3. In the winter, Peary and 6 men with 30 dogs set out for Fort Conger. They reached it, but not without cost. Peary's feet were badly frostbitten. After returning to the ship and recovering, Peary left for Fort Conger again with some of his Eskimos. They pushed past Lockwood's farthest point and around the north coast of Hazenland, where Peary glimpsed a mountain he had seen before. They were forced to return to Fort Conger due to a lack of provisions. The Windward met Peary at Peyer Bay, and they spent the summer re-establishing caches to Fort Conger. In the winter, several Eskimos fell ill, and Peary had to nurse them and prepare for the summer journey single-handedly. He left for Fort Conger again in April, intending to make it the base of his dash for the North Pole, but was forced to turn back due to difficult conditions. Although Peary's dream of reaching the North Pole was not realized during this journey, he continued his exploration in subsequent years. Chapter 33. The Expeditions of Abruzzi, Wellman, and Toll. Prince Louis Amadeus of Savoy, Duke of the Abruzzi, was a man born with a lust for adventure. Even in his youth he was known for his mountaineering skills, which surpassed those of his peers. In 1897, upon his return from his successful expedition to climb Mount Elias in Alaska, he conceived of an idea that would take him even further. He wanted to organize an expedition that would take him to the North Pole, a feat that had yet to be accomplished. He spent a year and a half planning and consulting with experts, ultimately purchasing a whaler named the Jason, which he renamed the Stella Polare. The Stella Polare was outfitted for 5 years, and included a team of skilled individuals such as Umberto Cagni as captain, Count Franco Quirini as lieutenant, Dr. A.C. Molinelli, and 3 alpine guides. On June 14, 1899, they set sail from Lorvik, near Christiania, and made stops at Tromsø, Hammerfest, Vardo, and Archangel, where they picked up 120 Siberian dogs. Their journey took them to Franz Josef Land, where they landed at Cape Flora, near Jackson's house. The Duke left a stockpile of provisions there in case of an emergency, ensuring his team's survival in case they lost their vessel. The Stella Polare continued its journey up the British Channel, encountering the members of the Wellman expedition on their way home in the Capella. They heard rumors of a new archipelago to the north of Franz Josef Land, but the Duke failed to find any evidence of it. The journey became challenging due to the ice, but they managed to make their way to Karl Alexander Land and Crown Prince Rudolf Land before reaching Cape Fligely. Unfortunately, progress was entirely impossible from that point, so the Duke decided to spend the winter in Teplitz Bay, where they could regroup and plan their next move. On September 8th, the ice in the harbor was in turmoil, and the Stella Polare suffered a severe pinch that caused it to spring a leak. The engine room was immediately flooded, and for 72 hours, half the crew worked to pump out the water, while the others transferred provisions and equipment to the shore. The ship was ultimately rescued thanks to the officers' and men's efforts, but since it was half filled with water, it was useless as a place of residence, and tents had to be established on land. Throughout the winter, short expeditions were undertaken as the weather allowed. During one of these excursions, the Duke was unluckily caught in a snowstorm, resulting in 2 of his fingers becoming so frostbitten that they had to be amputated. This was a significant blow to him, since the wound had not sufficiently healed by the beginning of March, preventing him from participating in the great sled expedition that was to be the highlight of the trip. Consequently, Captain Cagni took command, and began on the 13th with general instructions to venture as far north as possible. During the initial stages of the journey, he was accompanied by two supporting parties whose provisions he and his men subsisted on as long as possible, allowing his own meager supply to remain intact until he was well on his way. Lieutenant Querini led the first of these parties, which was never seen again. The Duke dispatched search teams in every direction, but no trace of their absent comrades was discovered, and it is only possible to assume that they either fell into a crevasse or were caught in a storm and perished. Meanwhile, Cagney and his trio pressed north with speed. The ice was fairly smooth, and by April 25th they had surpassed Nansen's record, reaching latitude 86 degrees 33. Sadly, their supplies ran low, and they had to hurry back. The journey there had been simple, but on the way back they faced numerous unforeseen obstacles that nearly starved them. The ice sheet they journeyed on kept drifting westward, taking them further from their destination bay. They had kayaks, but they were in disrepair, and the shifting ice made them difficult to use. Cagney even had to cross a channel on a tiny piece of ice, while his companions and gear were towed across on a larger block. They survived on their dogs for the last 2 weeks of their journey, with only 6 left of the original 80 when they reached their ship. Another winter in the damaged ship was unwise, so they stopped the leak, freed the ship with gun cotton, and arrived back at Hammerfest on September 6th. In 1894, the New York Herald dispatched Walter Wellman to locate Nansen and venture to the North Pole if possible. Departing from Tromsø on May 1st aboard the Ragnald Jarl, he aimed to utilize Spitsbergen as his sled expedition base, arriving at Walden Island shortly thereafter. After 2 weeks, Wellman and 13 men departed north with state-of-the-art equipment. After only 4 days, a sailor delivered the disheartening news that the ship had been destroyed by ice, with little salvageable. Undeterred, Wellman ordered the captain to construct a shelter from the wreckage while he continued onward. Unfortunately, the ice became too treacherous to continue, forcing the abandonment of the expedition 6 miles north of the Platituden Islands. Ultimately, the group returned to America safely. Unfazed by his initial setback, Wellman departed once more in 1898 to complete the exploration of Franz Josef Land. On July 28th he arrived at Cape Flora, where Jackson's houses remained in pristine condition. With Sir Alfred Harmsworth's consent, he relocated one of the houses to Cape Tegethoff, establishing it as his new headquarters. Over the ensuing months, he charted much of the unexplored territory in Franz Josef Land. However, he would have accomplished more if he had not sustained a severe leg injury from falling into a small crevasse, forcing a retreat. Thanks to scientific advancements and the knowledge gained from previous expeditions, the dangers of exploring the Arctic were minimized, and tragedies became rare. In the later years of the golden age of Arctic discovery, only 4 individuals, Baron Toll, F.G. Seaberg, and their 2 hunters, lost their lives in Arctic exploration, aside from Captain Cagney and his team during the Duke of the Abruzzi's expedition. Baron Toll focused his Arctic research on the Siberian Ocean's islands, leading several successful expeditions from 1885 onwards, which greatly expanded the world's understanding of the region's geology, meteorology, botany, and paleontology. In 1900, Toll set out on his final journey aboard the well-equipped laboratory ship Saria, with enough provisions to last 4 years. He spent the first winter at Timor before rounding Cape Chelyuskin and visiting Bennett Island the following summer. He was eventually frozen into Nurpcha Bay, where he met an auxiliary expedition led by Velosevich. On June 20th, Toll and 2 others began an exploratory journey. A record later found on Bennett Island by Lieutenant Kolchak revealed that they followed the north coast of Kotelny and Thaddeef Islands towards New Siberia. When the ice broke up, they used boats to reach Bennett Island on August 26th. The record concluded with the words, "Today we are going southwards. We have provisions for 14 to 20 days, all in good health." This is all that is known about the fate of Baron Toll and his companions. And Bruznev posits that they perished on their way from Bennett Island to New Siberia. The weather was turning cold, and ice was likely forming on the sea, making it impossible for them to cross in their boats. With only provisions for a few weeks and no warm clothing, it is likely that the Arctic claimed its victims. These losses were a great blow to the world of science, as they were two of its most able and enthusiastic men. In closing, in the twilight of the 19th century, humanity thirsted for exploration, driven by an insatiable desire to uncover the secrets of the Earth. Amidst the vast, uncharted landscapes that awaited discovery, none were more alluring than the ultimate prize, the North Pole. It was a race against time, weather, and human endurance, and the stage was set for an unforgettable saga. The story began with a cast of courageous pioneers, each with their unique motivations and methods. Among them, the skilled Arctic navigator and explorer, Robert Peary, and the seasoned Norwegian explorer, Fridtjof Nansen. As they prepared for the treacherous journey, they could not have known that their paths would eventually intertwine, their fates bound by the icy grip of the Arctic. As Peary embarked on a series of daring expeditions, facing setbacks and loss at every turn, his determination to conquer the pole only grew stronger. Meanwhile, Nansen set out on an entirely different course, relying on the drifting ice to carry his ship, the Fram, towards the pole. Each explorer faced brutal conditions and unimaginable hardships, but the glint of glory in their eyes never waned. In the final years of the race, a new contender emerged, Frederick Cook, a former colleague of Peary's who now sought the pole for himself. As the rivals closed in on the elusive prize, they endured devastating storms, treacherous ice, and crushing despair. Yet their perseverance and ingenuity, combined with the support of the native Inuit people, would ultimately lead them to the heart of the Arctic. On April 6, 1909, Peary, accompanied by Matthew Henson, an African-American explorer, and 4 Inuit guides, claimed to have reached the North Pole. However, their triumph was soon tainted by controversy, as Cook declared that he had already reached the pole a year earlier. Amidst the swirling storm of accusations and doubts, the question of who truly conquered the pole remains shrouded in mystery. The end.
This concludes Frozen Frontier, written by Bo Carson, narrated by Marcus Claxon. Visit brooksaudioBooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.